Hello everyone, I want to welcome you to week 6 of Bioethics 400, Responsible Conduct of Research. We're a little over a third of the way through the course, and just to remind you sort of what we're covering during the duration of this course, we've been focusing on issues of research integrity, this is again reminding you of the 8 sort of topic areas as identified by the U.S. Office of Research Integrity. In the last couple of weeks, we've really been focusing on issues around data acquisition and data management. Might seem surprising, but yes, collaborative research and collaborations in particular with between academia and industry fall largely under data acquisition and data management, but they do have some aspects that fall into different areas as well, including issues around publication and responsible authorship, conflict of interest, and scientific misconduct. And actually conflict of interest is going to be the topic that we're going to be focusing on this week. So what we're going to be talking about this week is conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment. And as always, there are a number of learning objectives for you for both this lecture as well as for the assigned readings and learning activities. So by the end of this week, you should be able to define conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment, be able to explain the different types of conflicts that can arise, including financial versus non-financial conflicts and individual versus institutional conflicts. In fact, you'll see that there are a variety of different types of conflicts that arise, not just issues around money. You'll be able to describe how conflicts of interest and commitment can adversely affect study design, and then finally you'll be able to outline, at least briefly, the different approaches that institutions use for managing or mitigating conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment. So before we start, I just want to remind you that objectivity is the sine qua non of scientific discovery, but bias in judgment is virtually impossible to eliminate. There are often subtle and not so subtle pressures that influence how we perceive and how we act. All research professionals understand the pressures of publishing, of getting funding, of getting new appointments, of getting promotions, and earning respect from their peers. And many, of course, strive for validation and even the highest order of recognition, the Nobel Prize. And in an effort to succeed, there are a myriad of areas in which bias can influence judgment and diminish objectivity. A desire to validate a pet theory, overconfidence about a particular concept, over-reliance on a belief held by a specific group, ruling out data that doesn't support a hypothesis, and internal or external pressures to get a specific result are all influences that may lead to distortions in objectivity. Any of these biases or pressures may lead to what sociologists call selective inattendance. Your mindset may cause you to overlook important data or to misperceive critical observations. Bias can be too subtle to recognize and too difficult to control. It can creep into how research questions are selected and framed, the choice of research design, the selection of research participants, and how the data are collected, analyzed, interpreted, and ultimately published. And a lot of the focus of addressing bias is trying to identify actual or perceived conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment, because these are often the types of things that can influence, either obviously or subconsciously, our objectivity and lead to bias in study design and execution. So I'm going to start by talking about what conflict of interest is. Now, this is the American Association of Universities definition. They describe individual conflicts of interest as arising in situations in which significant financial interests or other considerations may compromise or have the appearance of compromising an investigator's professional judgment in conducting or reporting research. By contrast, there's what we call institutional conflicts of interest. These occur when the institution, any of its senior management or trustees, or a department, school, or other subunit, or an affiliated foundation or organization has an external relationship or financial interest in a company that itself has a financial interest in a faculty research project. Now, there are two things I want to point out. First is that the association acknowledges that it's not just individuals that have conflicts of interest, but also groups, organizations, and institutions. Second, the association focuses primarily on what they call significant financial interests, which may be defined in a moment, but also acknowledge that there may be other conflicts that come into play. So when we talk about significant financial interest, this is the most commonly used definition. And it focuses on a variety of different areas. One is salary or other payments for services, and that can include, for example, consulting fees or honoraria that a faculty member receives. But in order for it to be considered a significant financial interest, this must exceed 10,000 US dollars in the next 12 months. And that is not just money that you receive as a faculty member, but also money that your spouse or your dependent children receive. So if I am consulting for a company like GlaxoSmithKline and they pay me $5,000 in any 12-month period, I am not deemed to have a significant financial interest. However, if I consult with GlaxoSmithKline and I earn $5,000 in that year, but it also turns out that my spouse works for GlaxoSmithKline and has a salary of $60,000 a year, then I actually do have a significant financial interest when it comes to any work that may affect that company. Now, there are other types of financial interest that I can have. I can have an equity interest, and these are things like stocks, stock options, etc., that have a fair market value of over $10,000 US, or which represent more than 5% ownership in any single publicly held entity. And again, this is not just the holdings that I have in terms of equity interest, but also those of my spouse and my dependent children. This often comes into play if, for example, I'm investing in a company, but I do work that influences that company's bottom line. As you learned last week when we were talking about academic industry partnerships, increasingly common situation is when a faculty member makes a discovery that the university patents and wants to develop, and so they spin it off into a startup company. These startup companies often may be publicly held entities, and the faculty member may be a part owner. And so anytime that that faculty member's ownership exceeds 5% of the total ownership of that entity, then they are seen as having a significant financial equity interest. Now, that's also true if you've got a privately held entity. So if I set up my own company, I have 100% ownership of that company, and so I have a significant equity interest for any work that I do that may affect that company's bottom line. You also have a significant financial interest if you serve as an officer in the company. For example, if you serve as the chief executive officer, you're on the board of directors, chief scientific officer, etc. This is true even if you do not receive any payment for your services or any equity interest in the company. So the mere act of actually being appointed to the board of directors creates a significant financial interest for you. And finally, you have a significant financial interest if you have any intellectual property rights. So this includes patents, copyrights, and royalties from those rights. So from the perspective of Clarkson University, because I do have, as I mentioned in the last lecture, 7 patents, 6 US and 1 European patent, I am seen as having a significant financial interest for any work that relates to HIV diagnostic testing, because that's the nature of my patents. Now, there are other considerations to take into account, and these include personal concerns, structural and institutional concerns, political and ideological beliefs, and conflicts of commitment. Okay? And all of these are intangible conflicts that can also compromise scientific objectivity. For example, conflicts of commitment, which may also be called conflicts of effort or conflicts of obligation, occur when the extent of time spent on the secondary activity competes with the time expected to be spent teaching, research, or service by the primary employer. So if I spend 50% of my time consulting for GlaxoSmithKline rather than actually recording lectures and teaching students like yourselves, then I am seen as having a conflict of commitment. Now, most universities have policies regarding this, and most of those policies usually allow for a faculty member to have 20% effort or 1 day a week for outside activity. Now, a conflict of conscience can also arise. This occurs when personal beliefs influence objectivity in research. For example, a scientist may have a particular view on abortion that influences their view on the scientific merit of a study that uses human embryonic stem cells. And so that might influence their decision about whether or not they are going to, say, support that project if it came forward to them in sort of a review and oversight role. So that might be a role on Clarkson's Institutional Review Board. It might be on an NIH study section determining whether or not this study gets funded. It might be on a promotion and tenure review committee, or it could even be as a peer reviewer. So those ideological concerns could influence whether or not that faculty member actually is objective in reviewing these sorts of projects. So there's a variety of things that can arise, essentially, and all of those issues that come up really can influence scientific objectivity, even when the researcher doesn't think that they have a conflict or believes that they can put aside their personal feelings and be objective. If I am serving on an NIH study section, which I do for the types of grants that I receive, I am seen as having a personal conflict of interest. For example, if I am asked to review a proposal by someone who is a friend or a close colleague. And so usually a rule of thumb that most NIH study sections require is that you cannot review the work proposal that's been submitted by anyone that you've worked with or published with in the last 3 years. You're also supposed to try to identify people that you have a personal relationship with, be it a positive or a negative relationship, anything that is seen as influencing whether or not you can be objective in evaluating them. And this can include something as simple as not liking a person or disagreeing with the nature of their work. So all of those are considered to be non-financial conflicts of interest. Okay, so here's an example of an individual conflict of interest. This is one that was reported in the newspapers a few years ago, and that involved a renowned child psychologist at Harvard, Dr. David Blumen. And over a decade, he has promoted the aggressive diagnosis and treatment of childhood bipolar disorder. This is a mood problem that was originally thought to be confined to adults. Now, at the same time, he earned at least $1.6 million annually in consulting fees from companies who made the antipsychotic medicines that would be prescribed to these children in order to treat bipolar disorder. So this is a pretty obvious one in terms of the nature of his conflict of interest. It's primarily a financial one, and it does obviously meet the standard of significant financial interest in the sense that he receives more than $10,000 US annually from these companies. Now, I would point out that when I talked about significant financial interest, I did say consulting fees or honorarium that are expected to exceed $10,000. Now, in this case, it's interesting because he was receiving consulting money from multiple companies. So that $10,000 figure is not per company, but it's actually an aggregate figure of all of the work you do, at least as it relates to a particular topic area where you might demonstrate bias. Now, there are a lot of other examples in the news. Most recently, for example, you probably heard that the CEOs and CFOs of several very highly respected teaching hospitals and research institutes in New York City, including Memorial Sloan Kettering, resigned their positions because they were seen as having conflicts of interest related to their serving on the boards of various pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And another really famous example involves the death of 18-year-old Jesse Gelsinger. This was at the University of Pennsylvania. He died as a result of an adverse reaction during a gene transfer trial. And this has been seen as a metaphor for egregious science, and particularly egregious conflict of interest in science. Specifically, the University of Pennsylvania's Institute of Human Gene Therapy, the trial sponsor, came under scrutiny because the researchers involved in the trial and the university had apparent yet undisclosed financial conflicts of interest. Specifically, the research was being conducted not by the university, but by researchers that were operating as part of a startup company designed to commercialize the, uh, the gene transfer technology that was being used as a result of this study. And so this clinical trial was really meant to be demonstration of the useful and effectiveness of this gene transfer technology in treating genetic disorders like OTC, which Jesse Gelsinger had. Now, the tragic results of this widely publicized trial alarmed both the public and the research community, and the University of Pennsylvania has subsequently changed many of its policies and has discontinued all human gene transfer experimentation at the Institute of Human Gene Therapy. Moreover, the principal investigator of that study, James Wilson, was forced to step down as president of the Institute of Human Gene Therapy. There can be really serious consequences when these things arise. In fact, after this case came to light, not only did the U.S. National Institutes of Health step in and investigate, but during the duration of that investigation, they suspended all research funds that was given to the University of Pennsylvania, not just research funds that was going to Dr. Wilson or to the Institute of Human Gene Therapy. So there can be significant financial consequences for a university and investigator when these things arise, as well as consequences that extend beyond the labs involved. If you think about it, if the National Institutes of Health is suspending all research monies to an institution like the University of Pennsylvania, that's in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It also means that you can't, during the duration of that investigation, you can't spend a single dollar on research studies supported by the NIH, and so that actually led to many important studies being halted for a period of time. There can also be legal consequences. Dr. Wilson and the University of Pennsylvania were sued by Jesse Gelsinger's family, and even a colleague of mine, famous bioethicist now at NYU, Dr. Art Kaplan, was named in that lawsuit because he had provided some recommendations and guidance, not officially, but just as part of a conversation he had with Dr. Wilson as to the design and conduct of the study. Now, he was eventually dropped from the lawsuit, but it can have wide-ranging consequences for everyone at the institution. Now, I do also want to talk about institutional conflicts of interest. Okay, so these are very different from individual conflicts of interest, and I've already alluded to them with the example of the University of Pennsylvania and Jesse Gelsinger's case. Okay, now institutional conflicts of interest arise when an institution's own financial interests or those of its senior officials pose risks of undue influence on decisions involving the institution's primary interests. For academic institutions, such risks often involve the conduct of research within that institution that could affect the value of the institution's patents or its equity positions or options in biotechnology, pharmaceutical, or medical device companies. Conflicts of interest at the institutional level may also arise when institutions seek or receive gifts or grants from companies. For example, a gift of an endowed university chair or a grant for a professional society to develop a clinical practice guideline. In addition, institutional conflicts of interest exist when senior officials who act on behalf of the institution have personal financial interests that may be affected by their administrative decisions. For example, a department chair like myself or a dean who has a major equity holding in a medical device company could make decisions about faculty appointments and promotions, or even the assignment of office and laboratory space in ways that favor the interests of the company but compromise the overall research, educational, and clinical mission of the institution. Similarly, a hospital official with such a holding would be at risk of undue influence in making decisions about the use of the company's products for patient care. In situations like these, an individual's financial relationship also implicates the institution's interest. So you can see how the example that I gave earlier of the CEOs and CFOs of major research and treatment centers in New York City serving on the board of directors for pharmaceutical companies could raise concerns about an institutional conflict of interest. So in these cases, the senior officials' individual conflicts of interest also lead to an institutional conflict of interest. There are lots of examples of institutional conflicts of interest. For example, I am currently a member of Clarkson's IRB, Institutional Review Board. Again, that's the committee that reviews, approves, and oversees all human subjects research being done on the campus or by university faculty. In fact, I will become the chair of that board on July of this coming year. Now, those boards can be subject to institutional pressures. For example, if there is a research project that needs IRB review and approval, let's say it's a project from the NIH and will bring in $1 million a year in federal research funding. There can be pressure upon the IRB, myself, and the other members, either by the institution or simply by our own belief that approving this study will bring both this money and sort of increase the reputation for Clarkson University, both at a regional level but also at a national level. And so there's this institutional conflict of interest in which the decisions made by the IRB about whether or not to allow a research study to move forward can be influenced by these sorts of considerations. Now, where does a lot of this come from? Well, obviously, a lot of it relates back to the discussions we had last week, and that is specifically university interests and the rise of commercialization of science. So remember that before 1980, the U.S. federal government retained the rights to research and discoveries of the investigators it funded. Now, concurrently, biotech companies were having difficulty obtaining licenses to manufacture and market these discoveries, and as a result, the U.S. research enterprise really wasn't thriving. Now, Congress responded in 1980 by passing the BIE Act, which, as you recall, allows recipients of federal funds to obtain the title to the inventions that they develop under their federally funded projects and to transfer the technology to the private sector. And it also requires federally funded researchers to obtain patents for projects developed and to seek commercial opportunities and then report back to the National Institutes of Health on the use of their discoveries. So the BIE Act, in essence, and as you learned last week, removed the ban on campus entrepreneurship and allowed academic researchers to take an active role in the private applications and commercialization of this research. Now, this act has been a tremendous boon, especially to the universities that now encourage or even exhort their faculty members to apply for patents for their discovery. Of course, this enables the universities themselves to benefit significantly from the shared royalties, and ultimately many universities have thrived as a result of this commercialization and their increasing number of relationships with industry. But these financial relationships with industry are exactly the things that create conflicts of interest in universities, academic medical centers, and other institutions that carry out research, education, clinical care, or practice guideline development. It also creates conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment for the faculty themselves. Now, some of these relationships may generate significant benefits to an institution's primary missions. For example, it gives to endow named professorships or to fund the construction of research facilities, support the core teaching and research missions of these academic centers. Now, the question that arises for institutions as well as individual faculty members is whether or not the relationship with industry can be maintained in such a way that achieves the desired benefits but avoids the risks of undue influence on decision-making and the loss of public trust. So, how well does this work? Well, one survey of department chairs in medical schools and large independent teaching hospitals found that 27% of preclinical departments, or basic science departments, and 16% of clinical departments receive income currently from intellectual property licensing, and this is a direct benefit of the provisions of the BIE Act. Now, that does mean that there are obvious and increasing numbers of individual and institutional conflicts of interest and commitment, but identifying these may be difficult. This is particularly true in universities or other large institutions where no single individual or office may have knowledge of all such interests, and those responsible for identifying relationships may have to survey various parts of the institution to even begin to develop an inventory of relevant interests and relationships. Okay? So all of this creates a problem. Now, Clarkson University does have a conflict of interest committee on which I serve. We do have in place expectations of reporting. And all of this sort of relates to the question of how do you recognize and respond to potential conflicts of interest and commitment at the institutional level. And there are different approaches that are used. The standard ones are to focus on education, to mandate reporting, and then when a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest is identified, to come up with a management plan. And these management plans can involve simple disclosure of conflict of interest, can require some sort of mitigation of the conflict of interest, or can even lead to a prohibition on particular research activities if it is felt that the conflict of interest cannot be appropriately mitigated. And then finally, there's the issue of accountability. Now, it's really difficult to figure out which solution to recognizing and responding to conflicts of interest is best, and it really requires that the institution and the members of any conflict of interest committee or office analyze the strength of or magnitude of any potential conflict of interest or commitment, figure out ways of managing, if at all, the conflict of interest, and if it's too difficult to manage, what are the consequences of prohibiting or not prohibiting a specific research activity? So what I want to do is just spend a few minutes going through some of these different elements. So reporting. In the US, most institutions now require researchers to report to a conflict of interest committee all fees from consulting and advisory boards or lectures, royalty income, patents and other intellectual property, equity of any amount in a private or public company, sponsored travel. So what I mean by sponsored travel is if I am doing consulting work for a company like GlaxoSmithKline and they fly me to their headquarters down in North Carolina in order to give a talk or to meet with them, that is considered to be sponsored travel and must be reported, and also count the value of that travel counts towards the threshold for significant financial interest. And then finally, you have to report any relevant financial interests of related parties. So that is a spouse and a dependent child. This is required reporting, and at many institutions, what they've done is they've actually established an annual requirement in which all of these sorts of things have to be reported using a conflict of interest form. And then a committee or individual reviews those forms and determines whether or not there's a significant financial interest that needs to be addressed. Now, who do these reporting requirements apply to? Do they apply to only me as a faculty member, or me as my administrative role as department chair and as soon-to-be chair of the institutional review board, or do they apply to other people? And the fact of the matter is it generally applies to all researchers and other key personnel. So that includes postdoctoral research fellows, sometimes graduate students, staff members, etc. And this is true regardless of what the nature of the research that's being conducted. For example, do people that are doing basic research in chemical processes or developing new theories of in high energy plasma physics, or does it only apply to translational and clinical research that has a clear and direct line to commercialization or other financial interests? And the fact of the matter is everyone has to report it, because as you learned last week, private companies are particularly interested in basic research because it lays the foundations for later applied research and new commercializable discoveries. So many times they will actually license some of the basic discoveries that are made in these biology, chemistry, and physics labs, engineering labs, etc., that really don't seem to have a clear um, commercial product as their end goal. But nevertheless, they can actually be quite financially lucrative for an institution. Now, you also have to report any sorts of funding, and this includes but is not limited to any money that you receive from the federal government via an NIH grant or other form of grant, anything that you receive from industry or any other commercial interest, any private or philanthropic foundation. Essentially, any money that you receive or any benefits that you receive or any equity interest that you receive, any intellectual property rights, anything that you do is potentially reportable as a conflict of interest. Now, once you've reported it, the Conflict of Interest Committee or some group will review it and determine whether or not a conflict exists. And if a conflict exists, a management plan has to be developed in collaboration with the faculty member to manage, reduce, or eliminate the conflict. And sometimes these management plans can be quite simple, and sometimes they can be quite complex. But they can include some sort of disclosure or modification of the research plan. It might be something as simple as if I am conducting a psychological survey of students on campus about their understanding or appreciation of particular computer brands. Do you prefer Apple versus Dell? But I am receiving money from a computer company to conduct this research. I might be required simply to disclose to you during the consent process that I am conducting this research on behalf of Dell Computers. Okay. May require modification of the research plan or a change in personnel or responsibilities. It could be, for example, that I, as a faculty member with a potential conflict, am actually excluded from conducting particular parts of the research activity or overseeing or supervising particular people. Essentially, figuring out ways of changing my role and responsibilities so that I cannot influence either overtly or covertly or subconsciously the design, conduct, and interpretation of the research findings in order to eliminate any potential bias. It may require some level of monitoring of the research by an outside independent reviewer. It may require a reduction or elimination of the financial interest. You might have a situation in which you are told that, well, if you want to work on this project, then you have to sell off your stock options. That did arise for me a few years back when I was serving as the chair of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Human Studies Review Board. That was a federal advisory board that would review all studies involving intentional human exposure to EPA-regulated compounds and give recommendations to the EPA regarding the ethical and scientific design of the study and whether or not those studies could, one, proceed, and two, could the EPA use the data to make regulatory decisions. At the time, my financial planner had actually invested a significant amount of my retirement portfolio into some funds that were focusing on agriculturally oriented biotech companies like Monsanto. And as a result, because some of the things that were coming before the board involved Monsanto-related products, and thus my decisions as chair of the EPA's Human Studies Review Board could actually influence whether or not Monsanto made a profit or lost money on a particular product. I was required by the federal government to sell my interest in those companies, something that I was happy to do. And then finally, there's often periodic audits of a person's activity. Now, I did mention that institutions like Clarkson usually require that all researchers fill out a conflict of interest declaration form once a year. But in the case of Clarkson and most other universities, you're also expected to, although this is not heavily monitored and can be a problem, but you are expected to revise that form anytime during the year if you develop a new relationship or any new potential significant financial or other interest arises. Now, what are some of the current recommendations that are being made? Well, some of the recommendations that come from groups like the American Association of Universities and others, organizations that focus heavily on the issue of conflict of interest, include figuring out ways of expanding the definition of significant financial interest. Is that $10,000 US threshold appropriate? And there are a lot of institutions that do not believe that. Is $10,000 of financial interest significant enough to sway an individual in such a way that they might either knowingly or unconsciously introduce bias into a research study? And the answer is, it depends on that individual's own current socioeconomic status and level of wealth. So $10,000 for someone like Bill Gates is nothing. $10,000 for a postdoctoral fellow that is earning maybe $32,000 a year is significant, right? So the definition of significant financial interest is actually on a sliding scale, and something as little as $1,000 can be a significant financial interest for one person, whereas $100,000 could be a significant financial interest for another person. And so there's a concern about whether or not we need to change this definition of significant financial interest. In some places, including the federal government, the EPA, for example, for their senior officials, which I was considered to be, actually sets a dollar threshold of 1 penny for a significant financial interest. Other recommendations include treating all research consistently, regardless of the funding source. Some institutions, particularly large institutions, that really have a lot of faculty, a lot of research going on, there tends to be a focus primarily on the studies that are large or have significant levels of funding. But some people argue that focusing on the amount or nature of the funding source is inappropriate, because you can have harms both to participants of studies as well as to the institution and faculty, even from a basic science study that's being funded by only $5,000 from a small local biotech company. There's recommendations that disclosures be made by everyone, not just faculty, that research involving human subjects in particular requires special scrutiny. Often there is a problem in that human subjects research, as you know, is reviewed, approved, and overseen by an IRB, an institutional review board. Usually those IRBs are completely separate and independent from any conflict of interest committee. Often the membership is completely different as well. The fact that I serve on both Clarkson's conflict of interest committee and the IRB is unusual. And so sometimes there's the concern that human subjects protocol that is being reviewed and approved that review is occurring in a vacuum, and the individuals who are reviewing and approving that protocol don't know about any potential conflicts of interest that the investigator might have, and those conflicts of interest might lead them to pay a little bit more attention and give more scrutiny to the research protocol itself. There's also the idea that disclosures should be made not only to just a conflict of interest committee, but to other various constituencies. Should, for example, all of the students on campus be able to access the conflict of interest reports, as well as any disclosure, mitigation, or elimination plans that are approved by the Conflict of Interest Committee at Clarkson University. And this all relates in some ways to wider use of and better integration of conflict of interest committees into the overall management of research at an institution like Clarkson University. So what are some ongoing areas of concern? Well, one is how to make sure that those who need to disclose are doing so, and that the disclosure is complete. I gave you an example earlier in this lecture of Dr. Biederman at Harvard, and in fact Harvard did not know that this renowned child psychiatrist actually was earning $1.6 million annually in consulting fees from various companies because he didn't tell them, and that there was no sort of oversight and audit mechanism to make sure that faculty members at Harvard were properly and accurately reporting any potential conflicts of interest. There are concerns about can and when conflicts of interest, either individual or institutional, can be eliminated. And in fact, eliminating institutional conflicts of interest can be very, very difficult, as you can imagine. Other areas of concern: what is an acceptable conflict of interest management plan for investigators with financial conflicts of interest conducting human studies research, and how should the plan change when there is also an institutional conflict of interest? Perfect example was the case of Jesse Gelsinger and the University of Pennsylvania that I mentioned. And then finally, as I just alluded to on the last slide, how does one coordinate the activities of this conflict of interest committee with the IRB? With the IACUC, that's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. It's similar to an IRB, but reviews, approves, and oversees all research involving laboratory animals. And we'll talk about that starting in week 12 of this course. And then finally, how do you coordinate it as well with the sponsored projects office? That's the sponsored research services office at Clarkson University. What Clarkson, I think, does a fairly good job in the sense that you have overlap between the Conflict of Interest Committee and most of these groups. So I serve on both the Conflict of Interest Committee and the IRB, and the head of the Sponsored Research Services Office, Shannon Robinson, is also a member of the Conflict of Interest Committee. So there is careful review and oversight of all of these things, at least at Clarkson University, maybe less so at other institutions, particularly institutions that aren't considered a high research activity institution like Clarkson is. So I just want to close with a couple case studies, or 3 case studies for you guys to consider. And I'm going to read through them, but then I want you to pause the lecture and think back to what you've just heard, as well as what you might have read in the assigned and optional readings, and determine whether or not this individual has a conflict of interest, and if they do, how it might be mitigated. So case study 1 involves the case of a researcher that's examining the safety and efficacy of a study drug to treat ovarian cancer. And that study is being sponsored by a pharmaceutical company that actually manufactures this study drug. Now, the PI earns $5,000 in financial compensation annually as an advisory board member for the pharmaceutical company. So, questions I would pose to you are, do they have a conflict of interest? Is it financial or non-financial? Does it meet the threshold, if it's a financial conflict of interest, of being significant? And if so, what would be an appropriate disclosure, mitigation, or other management plan? Second case study involves a research coordinator, so not a faculty member, but someone that is working under the supervision of a faculty member as a member of a study team, but not actually responsible for the overall management of that study. Now, that research coordinator is conducting psychological assessments for a study examining the incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder among war veterans. This is a study that's sponsored by the federal government, by the National Institutes of Health, and it turns out this research coordinator also receives financial compensation as a consultant for the company that developed the psychological assessment tool. Let's say that that level of financial compensation is about $9,000 a year. Okay, but it can vary from a few dollars a year to 3 years ago, she earned $20,000 a year. Do they have a conflict of interest? Is it financial or non-financial? And how, if a conflict of interest exists, should it be managed? Finally, and this is a case that doesn't involve necessarily research, but is something that often arises. So we have the case of Dr. Takahashi, who is an assistant professor and is asked to review a paper describing a phase 3, that is a late-stage clinical trial of an investigational drug in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And I'll explain what the different phases of clinical trials are starting in week 13 or 14 of this course. Now, Dr. Takahashi herself has no personal conflicts of interest related to the research, but her department chair has a major research contract from the company that owns and makes the drug. And that contract provides research support for federal faculty members in the department, including some of Dr. Takahashi's collaborators. So she does not receive this research support, but members of her department do, and her department chair has an important contract with the company that is being described in this paper. So should she review the paper, what are the potential conflicts here? Are they individual or institutional? Are they financial, non-financial? And what might be the mitigation plan, if any? In this case, it really would be, if you decide that there's a conflict of interest, that it would probably be a simple prohibition that she not review the paper and instead recommend someone else to do it. Okay. So with that, I'm going to end this lecture, and I want to encourage you to read carefully all of the assigned readings. The optional readings for this week are pretty extensive and range from looking at research involving human subjects to sort of more broad issues about the impact of academic industry collaborations on research study design and methodologies. So I want to encourage you to read as many of those as you can, but focus on the ones that really are of interest to you and your field of study. And I'll look forward to seeing you guys all online a little later this week.